Justin, a warm welcome to Facing the Canon.
Thank you so much for having me, J.John. Great to be here. Thank
Delighted. You. Now, who are you? You're a playwright, you're an actor, you're a director, you're a producer, you're a musician. What are you?
A bit of all of those things. A jack of all trades, master of none. I'm all of those things. I'm someone that has managed to keep the wolf from the door for 25 years or so, doing a bit of all of the above.
Which is your favourite?
Oh gosh, which is my favourite? So the Church Times asked me this recently,
yes,
in a back page interview. Which do you prefer more, acting or writing? And I kind of think they're all part of each other, really, in a way. You know, the actor's job is to become the person who would say those words. And the writer's job is to write words which actors are able to say.
Yes.
You know, so
yes,
it's kind of all part of the same thing in a way. It's also a bit like being a parent, you know, as a writer or a producer or a director, you're kind of, it's about empowering and giving life to
sure,
the words, the voice, the performance of other people, and sort of stepping back in a way, getting out of the way. But in a funny kind of way, the same is true of writing. That it's sort of, yes, you use yourself all the time. You're using your imagination, your voice, your words, your wit, hopefully, your empathy. But the imperative all the time is to get that picture that you remember into the heads of your readers. To get a portrait of that person that you met,
yes,
that so affected you, into the mind and the imagination of your readers. And in a way, it's about sort of getting yourself out of the way.
Sure.
So I think, I mean, this is, when I occasionally teach young acting students at drama schools and things, I sort of say this is the kind of conundrum about creative work, creative arts, that you're using yourself all the time. You're drawing on your own resources, but in a curious way, at the coalface of creative work, self disappears.
Yes. When you went off to university, you went to Oxford, mm-hmm, you studied the greats.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And did you know then what you wanted to end up doing?
Well, if you'd asked me when I was 8 what you want to be when you grow up, I would have said a writer. So the acting thing came along a bit later. At school and then big time at university. So I did a degree in classics, Latin and Greek literature and philosophy, in between 17 undergraduate productions.
And you can speak ancient Greek and Latin?
Well, in theory, yes.
In theory, yeah.
Yes, it's a while ago now, but mostly written, to be honest.
How's your modern Greek?
How's the modern Greek? Kalimera.
Oh,
well,
Kalimera.
On this, of course, this journey to Jerusalem, we spent quite a few weeks walking across Greece.
Of course, you did.
And one of my jobs was to organise restaurants every night for the
yes,
walkers, with an interesting concoction of vegan, how many vegans, how many pescatarians, how many, you know, whatever.
All of that.
In Greek, you know, and Google Translate got very good at that.
Just piece together, like, quickly, from graduating from Oxford, how did the little links in the chain come about in your life?
Well, after Oxford, I was mad keen on acting by that stage, and so I went on to do a year's postgraduate training at Drama Studio in West London and launched myself into the theatre world as an actor. And after a very short time, the writing started to take over. Had far too many ideas of my own just to remain an actor, just to remain a mouthpiece for other people. So, and I had a few successes then as a writer, and so the writing started to take over. There was a play called Scaramouche Jones, which first Warren Mitchell did on the radio, and then the great Pete Postlethwaite took on and did on stage for a number of years, you know, 2001, 02, 03, and so on, which was an amazing opportunity and sort of put me on the map as a writer. All of this time, I've been involved in the Greenbelt Arts Festival, a Christian festival of the arts, and in all the sort of links that one makes through extraordinary networks of that kind. So it was at Greenbelt that I first met the singer, priest and activist Garth Hewitt,
Yes.
for example, founder of the Amos Trust, which is a small human rights charity based in the UK, which supports partner projects all over the world. It was Garth Hewitt that first started bringing peacemakers from Palestine and Israel to the UK. Of all the leaders in the UK churches, Garth was there first as a pioneer, engaging with the indigenous church of the Holy Land,
Sure.
Palestinian Christians in Bethlehem and in the West Bank and in Jerusalem, and bringing remarkable representatives of that community to the UK. And so that's what I probably sort of sparked my interest
Yes.
in Israel-Palestine. My lovely godmother, Carla, was a German Jew who had been born in Palestine. Her father was one of the early Zionist settlers in the early part of the 20th century, and then they moved subsequently to the UK. And I grew up in North London in an area with a huge German Jewish community, in sort of West Hampstead, Swiss Cottage, Golders Green, that kind of area.
Yes.
Our family GP was German Jewish. My wife's first employer in the flower shop in Golders Green was German Jewish. My school was 40% Jewish, and so on. So a bit of the Middle East has always been swimming around in the atmosphere. So as an actor, a writer, producer, somebody, a lifelong Christian believer, and someone engaged in that sort of meeting point of faith and the arts and the kind of peace and justice movement, I found myself being drawn into the work of Amos Trust, a Christian human rights charity working in Nicaragua, South Africa, Tanzania, in India and Palestine. In 2003, I got very involved in the anti-war movement and wrote a very angry, vulgar satire called The Madness of George W.,
Yes.
which was produced on the Fringe in London early on in 2003, before the American-led invasion of Iraq, but then transferred to the West End and ran all through that year, all through the formal period of hostilities and beyond, and was a big success. And there was a natural confluence between the anti-war movement and the movement for Palestinian rights. And so over the years, I've been increasingly drawn to lend my creative efforts to human rights campaigning. And I think the vision of my faith, you know, as a teenager going to the Greenbelt Arts Festival and growing up to find a kind of a creative vocation and trying to forge these things together. For me, I suppose the image that springs to mind is this idea of a crossroads where the arts and faith and justice meet. And that's where a lot of my work has flourished.
Well, your book, Walking to Jerusalem, okay, when did that thought come to your mind that I'm going to walk to Jerusalem from London?
Well, I suppose the incitement, when I look back to what the first spark, the first kind of catalyst, was standing in the ruins of a demolished Palestinian home in the village of Al-Khada near Bethlehem in 2014. I took a trip with Amos Trust to the first ever Bethlehem Live Festival.
Yes.
In Bethlehem in 2014. This is a Palestinian Christian organization, the Holy Land Trust in Bethlehem, run by the amazing visionary Sami Awad, someone who I often refer to by way of shorthand as the sort of Palestinian Gandhi.
Yes.
And his inspiration was to create something equivalent to the Greenbelt Festival in the occupied West Bank. And so this was the first ever Bethlehem Live Festival. And we were there, a group of artists from the UK, performing at and supporting this festival. And in that very week that we were there, June 2014, 3 teenage Israeli settlers disappeared They were hitchhiking from the settlement of Gush Etzion near Hebron in the West Bank to their homes in central Israel. They disappeared as it transpired. Subsequently, they'd been kidnapped and, in fact, murdered. But all of that week of the festival, and while we were there, we saw the first sort of spate of collective punishment being handed out by the Israelis up and down the West Bank. House demolitions, refugee camps being invaded and tear-gassed, mass arrests, rubber bullets and live ammunition fired on crowds. Even by the end of that week, 5 Palestinian children had been shot dead, all in the name of a supposed police action to try and find these missing teenagers. Now, that very soon escalated into, well, there was the discovery of their bodies and the circumstances in which they had been killed, and then the third attack on Gaza, the third Gaza war, which raged all throughout that summer with horrific consequences. And so we had this bizarre experience of attending concerts and street performances in the beautiful old streets of Bethlehem in the evening. And this wonderful street called Star Street, an old Ottoman street from the Ottoman era, stretching from the top of Bethlehem all the way down to Manger Square. All the closed shops being opened up and turned into venues, little cafes, puppet theatres, music venues, art exhibitions, and so on. And crowds of Palestinians, Christians and Muslims together, and internationals engaging and enjoying these wonderful creative events, celebration of the sort of spirit and culture of Bethlehem. And then during the day, we were going out to Nablus, Jenin, Hebron, and seeing firsthand the impact of this appalling wave of violence, including a visit to this village, Al-Khada, near Bethlehem. Al-Khada means the green man in Arabic, and it's their name for St. George. St. George is an extraordinary figure in the Middle East, revered by all 3 faiths. So there's a legend that St. George was imprisoned in the village of Al-Khada shortly before his martyrdom. The true story of St. George is that he was a Roman soldier, a native of Palestine, who refused to take part in the persecution of Christians under Diocletian, and then was martyred for his faith. And we visited this family whose house had been demolished 2 days before. And they were pulling chairs out of the rubble.
Yes, to give you hospitality under
to seat us in the shade of their fig tree. And they insisted that we all sat. They wouldn't allow any of us to stand. And there was their house, 2 awful piles of rubble, bristling with iron rods and smashed lintels and children's toys and domestic utensils. And they were kissing us on the cheek and saying, "Thank you for coming." So we were deeply affected by this. You can tell I'm moved just by telling the story. And we said, "Our hearts are broken for you. We understand that your voice is silenced, and we promise to use our voices to tell your story." And that's, in a way, what I've been trying to do ever since.
No, I've got, huge empathy. I'm Greek Cypriot, and there was an invasion in Cyprus, and my parents lost their home. My grandmother lost her home. We lost relatives. In fact, only recently, many of my family were discovered in a mass grave and identified. So I've got a real empathy for when someone else comes and, that pain. And I feel it as you're speaking now, for my own people in Cyprus. And I went back to Cyprus not so long ago, and I went back to my home where I lived as a child. And obviously Turkish people are living there who were very lovely. They invited us in for dinner. And it felt a little bit awkward because it was like, I used to live here.
Well, that's right. One of the ladies who joined us in Jordan to walk across into the West Bank for the last part of the pilgrimage was Carol, a Palestinian lady who had grown up in a refugee camp in Lebanon, So she had never known her parents' home in Palestine, in Jaffa, as Palestinians call it.
Yes.
And this was the first time she'd ever attempted to go back. And she said, I don't know whether they'll discover that I'm Palestinian and stop me at the border. I don't know, but I have to try. And part of that time, while we were there in the West Bank, she made a trip across, through Israel into Jaffa or Jaffa to see the street where her parents lived. And she said it was very, very painful to see this as an entirely Jewish area now, and none of the refugees of 1948 have ever been allowed to go back.
No. Canon Andrew White and I have ministered together in the Middle East for about 30 years now, and we've been to Gaza, and I was shocked at the state of it. We went over to take medicines to sick children and babies, and it was, I've been to a lot of developing countries over the years. I don't think I've ever seen anything as bad as that.
No.
It is
well, it's a living
awful.
hell now.
It is, isn't it?
I mean, Amos Trust, the human rights charity that was my partner in mounting the walk to Jerusalem, supports the Al-Ali Hospital in Gaza City, which is a Christian foundation.
I've been there.
Yeah, you know it. And one of the programs they support is breast cancer screening, because the equipment which is needed for radiotherapy is embargoed by the Israel's blockade. And so if breast cancer is detected, they're performing full double mastectomies, which we've not done in this country for decades. 2 miles up the coast, there in Ashkelon, in Israel, there's a state-of-the-art cancer therapy clinic, and there in Gaza City, they're working under conditions that we probably had here in the 1950s.
Sure.
Add to that, of course, the cancer rates have soared through the roof in Gaza because of all the depleted uranium in all the munitions which Israel has dumped on Gaza over the last 10 years in 3 wars. The fact that no building materials are allowed into Gaza. And so when people rebuild their houses, they're using rubble, which is contaminated with radioactive material. So they're actually bringing contaminated material into their houses. So you have 2 million people now living in a strip of land 5 miles wide by 25 miles long, the most densely populated patch of Earth on the planet. And it's a vast open-air prison camp. 95% of the water in Gaza is undrinkable. 80% of people dependent on food aid, 30% of children with acute anemia. And of course, since the Great March of Return in May of this year, which the 70th anniversary of what Palestinians call the Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948, what Israel celebrates as the 70th anniversary of its creation. Thousands and thousands of Palestinians massed on the border fence of Gaza, walking in the direction of Jerusalem in what they called the Great March of Return, and were shot at indiscriminately by Israeli soldiers, well, more than 200 now have died as a result of that, and many more wounded, with a predominance of injuries in the kneecap and the groin area. So there is a really desperate situation in Gaza.
So amongst all of that emotion, you decide to go on a walk.
Yes.
So
why? Yes.
London to Jerusalem.
London to Jerusalem.
Right. So go on. How did you plan this walk?
Well, as the year 2017 approached, we had a kind of perfect storm of Palestinian anniversaries coalescing. It was going to be the 10th year of the blockade of Gaza, the 50th year of Israel's military occupation, and the centenary of the Balfour Declaration. So the Balfour Declaration was when the British government, 100 years ago, made its promise to establish a national homeland for the Jewish people in Palestine. It had a caveat, this promise, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done to compromise or prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, by which he meant the Palestinians. 90% of the population. So they were relegated to the status of non-Jews. They didn't have a name, and they didn't have political rights. They had civil and religious rights. But in any case, the second half of that promise was never kept.
Yes.
The Hungarian Jewish writer Arthur Koestler, writing from Israel in 1949, described the Balfour Declaration as probably one of the most improbable political documents of all time, in which one nation solemnly promised a second the country of a third.
Yes.
So at the time that the Balfour Declaration was published, Britain was fighting the Ottoman Empire for possession of Gaza, of Palestine, the 4 battles of Gaza, Lawrence of Arabia, all of that stuff. And so we weren't even the governing power in Palestine, but we'd already promised it to create the Jewish homeland. And there's a story in the book which I recount where my dear friend Ahmed Massoud is a Gazan Palestinian who lives in London, had brought his mum over for a visit to the UK. Very unusually, the border between Gaza and Egypt was open for a short while in 2011 because the Morsi government in Egypt, had opened that border. And Fatima, his mum, had been able to get a visa and incredibly come to the UK to meet his wife for the first time, to meet her grandson for the first time. And there she was in my kitchen, larger than life. And it was an amazing experience having her there. And I asked her at one point, I said, how do you cope day to day with the anger you must feel? Because of the siege, because of the occupation, the loss of your home in 1948. And she grinned rather mischievously and pointed at me and said, well, actually, she said, the anger goes further back to you and your Balfour Declaration of 1917. And I said to Ahmed, is that right? Do Palestinians still think about that? He said, yes, every Palestinian.
Yeah. He
said, if you go to Gaza one day, as a Brit, you'll find kids on the street chanting Balfour, Balfour, like that. For us in the West, it's forgotten history.
Yeah, it is.
For Palestinians, they're still living with the consequences of it.
What do you say, Justin, to the Jewish people who believe that God gave them the land?
Goodness me. I mean, it's such a difficult question, that, isn't it? The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. God gave all the lands to all of us, didn't he?
But they believe.
They believe in
that they have
a unique claim to the Holy Land.
Yes.
Yes. Well, I suppose taking it one step further back, all I would say in response to that is that if you believe in God and you believe in a God of love, and then you go and visit Palestinian communities in the West Bank or Gaza, and if you believe that God wants people to be subjected to those conditions, and that the necessary corollary of your divinely authorized claim to the land is to reduce the indigenous inhabitants of that land to a state of virtual slavery, to dispossess them of their homes, to drive out, the 700,000 Palestinians who were driven out in 1948 and have been never allowed to return, and now been living in refugee camps in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan for 70 years. If this is all the will of God, then it's not the God that I believe in. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That's what I say.
Yes.
So with this perfect storm of anniversaries approaching, we got our thinking caps on and...
as to what you could do.
What we could do that would be a grand, crazy stunt or symbolic gesture that would be an appropriate response as people campaigning for peace and justice in the Middle East, as British people, and thinking about what Fatima had said to me, the anger, the primary betrayal for Palestinians starts with the British 100 years ago. So we thought, well, people have been traveling to the Holy Land for 2,000 years as conquerors, crusaders, colonialists, penitents as well. What about a pilgrimage of penance, a pilgrimage as British people to walk from London to Jerusalem to say sorry for the actions of our country 100 years ago, which have subjected the Palestinian people to a century of dispossession, injustice and suffering. How mad would that be, to walk from London to Jerusalem? It could also be an incredible expression of freedom of movement. The same friend, Ahmed Massoud, described when he first came to the UK, he came as an undergraduate through the British consulate scheme in Gaza to come and study in the UK. And he described taking a train journey from London to Edinburgh. And he said, I just couldn't believe it. Sitting for hours in the train with rolling green countryside, hundreds and hundreds of miles, no checkpoints, no walls, no barriers. He said it was the most wonderful journey I'd ever experienced.
Yes.
Coming from Gaza.
Yeah,
and
sure.
I thought, a walk where we would be exercising
we take it for granted.
Our freedom of movement across Europe as Brits.
Yeah.
Maybe not for much longer, possibly.
Yeah.
But,
but we have...
But that, to walk unimpeded across 11 countries across Europe. So enacting the Palestinians' right of return, which is denied, celebrating freedom of movement, a walk of penance. And the third element we just said was that it was a walk of hope.
Yes.
That we walk in hope that one day all peoples in the Holy Land will live in peace as neighbours with full equal rights.
Yeah. Do you know, there are some very moving moments in the book and some very amusing moments within the book. I was just very intrigued that you asked a friend of yours about doing the walk and what did he think of the walk. And the friend that you asked was...
Penhado, a polar explorer.
So he'd gone on a serious walk and he said to you...
Well, he said, I said, are we mad thinking we can do this, to walk from London to Jerusalem? He said, no, of course not. Well, he said, yes, you are, yes, but no, of course you can do it. And I said, well, do we need to train for months and months? And he said, no, just do it. You'll get started and you'll build up your stamina as you go, which was very encouraging.
Had you done a long walk before?
Quite a few.
Quite a few, but not this...
Not this far,
no. This involved 11 countries.
11 countries, that's right.
But you didn't walk on water.
No, we crossed 3 seas.
You crossed 3 seas.
By boat.
And you didn't go to my homeland.
We didn't go to Cyprus. No.
So you could have got a boat from Cyprus, but you didn't want to do that.
That's right.
Because you really wanted to go the route that Palestinians have to travel.
Yeah.
Okay. What was hard about the walk?
Blisters. Chafing body parts.
Now where did you pick up this old wives' tale that you have to wear 2 pairs of socks?
2 pairs of socks.
Did someone tell you that?
That was in the first week walking through Kent. The received wisdom, it's sort of fundamentalist wisdom amongst walkers, serious walkers, is 2 pairs of socks. To avoid blisters. It's not true.
No.
It wasn't till the end of Italy, that I made the idiotically simple discovery that it's 1 pair of socks, not 2. 2 pairs of socks make your feet hot.
Yes.
And then you get blisters.
There you go.
And so there's lots of gruesome descriptions of blisters.
So you had blisters, your first night, people snoring.
Lots of snoring. Yeah.
I know. How did you cope with that?
Well, I evolved this method of closing my ears to the snoring, where it took weeks, obviously, to evolve this, where I got, one ear embedded into the pillow like that, and then I worked out a way of putting my finger over there and then using my other hand to weight down the other hand, like that. And sometimes putting a book on top, so this was closed as well.
Yeah.
And then eventually it worked. And also, obviously, working out who didn't snore.
Yes.
And making sure I got to share rooms with them. As one of the leaders, one of the organisers of it.
Now, how many people walked with you for various parts of the walk?
Well,
in
more
total?
than 100 walkers took part.
And age range?
From 18, well, no, 14, because my boy Jacob, and in fact, my youngest son Joey, who was
joined you
11
Yeah.
at that point,
all
joined
the
us.
way up to
70.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just give us a rough idea. You started in London.
We started in London. We were following two ancient routes, the Via Francigena, or the Way Through France, which is a pilgrimage route from Canterbury to Rome that was established around the 9th century, something like that. And that takes you, well, obviously London to Canterbury, and then across northeastern France, from Calais, down through the Pas de Calais, through the battlefields of World War I, into the Champagne region, and then heading towards the French Alps, crossing into Switzerland. And then we climbed the Alps and crossed the Alps at the Great St. Bernard Pass, which was an incredible experience.
Yes.
The Hospice of St. Bernard has been opened for 1,000 years
Yes.
at the pass without ever closing. And there's still the canons, as they call them. I mean, they're not monks, they're canons.
Yes.
Canon J.John,
Yes.
are still there, still providing hospitality.
Yes.
They still have St. Bernard's dogs, you know.
Wow.
And that was an extraordinary experience. And my older 3 children...
So they welcomed all of you?
They did. It was wonderful.
Did they know that you were passing by?
Well, yes, because there's a canonry which provides monastic-style sort of accommodation, and because they're so oversubscribed, they have a sort of hotel attached to that, and we had a booking there, so you know they knew we were coming, and then over the Great St. Bernard Pass down into Italy, into the
Yes.
Aosta Valley, and following the Via Francigena then as far as Piacenza. And because we weren't going to Rome, we diverted eastwards at that point down towards Ancona. So they were picking up the Via Emilia, one of the Roman roads, and the Via Flaminia down the coast.
Yes.
The sort of Adriatic Riviera of the Italian coast, which was amazing. Very, very hot at this time of year, going through June, July. So very early starts in the morning, sometimes getting up, you know, at 5:30 and leaving at 6 or 6:30 in the morning to try and beat the heat. And walking 30, 35 kilometers a day, sometimes as much as 40 a day. So then we got the ferry across the Adriatic to Durrës in Albania, and we picked up a Roman road called the Via Egnatia, which was built first in about 150, 160 BC to link Rome with Constantinople. And that became the road linking the two capitals of the Roman Empire. And incredibly, there are still flagstones in places through Greece and Turkey from the original Roman road. It was repaired over the centuries by the Romans and then subsequently by the Ottoman Empire. And so it was kind of still in use right up until, you know, comparatively recently, and long stretches of motorway through eastern Greece and through western Turkey are simply called Egnatia still after the road. So we walked to Istanbul, following, broadly speaking, the Via Egnatia, and we visited many refugee camps and refugee projects
on the way
in Greece, and that was very moving, very challenging and very, very touching and also provoking experience. One of our walkers, a wonderful lady, Jude, retired doctor from Western Australia, met a young Iraqi boy in a refugee camp in Kavala in eastern Greece, whose mother had just been detained in Turkey. She had been part of the group that had been accepted into Greece as refugees. And then she had been seemingly, arrested, rearrested by Greek police, had all her money and all her papers taken from her and kicked over the border into no man's land, been picked up by Turkish police and then put in a detention centre in Turkey. And this 15-year-old lad was having to look after his younger siblings in this refugee camp. And Jude was very, very profoundly upset by this and wanted to intervene. And so she along with the help that we were emailing lawyer friends back home. I have a very good friend in my church who's an asylum lawyer, specialises in asylum law, and making representations to the Greek consulate in Edirne and so on. And so while we were still continuing the walk, there was a sort of intervention going on to try and get this lady, Rasha, released. And eventually, some months later, we found out that she had been released. And that Jude, along with Arthur, one of the walkers, visited the Greek consulate in Edirne and made representations to them and said, all her paperwork's in order. She's been received as an asylum seeker into Greece. Why has she been kicked back into Turkey? Why is she separated from her family? Please get on with it, and so on. And eventually it worked.
Yes.
So, that was an interesting... It was a very interesting episode, or series of episodes, because I suppose it was, in microcosm, I empathized with Jude's feeling of being so provoked, so moved and so challenged by a particular situation where you felt you couldn't not do anything. You had to get involved somehow and do something.
Yes. What I find fascinating is, as I read your book, and reading the story of the journey, you then kind of throw kind of a curveball. A curveball comes at you, thinking, where did that come from? And one of those being that you just mentioned randomly as you began the walk. You went to sleep. You had a dream about your father, and your father and your brother actually died tragically.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
When did that happen?
That happened in 1988. When I was 19, I lost my father and my brother in a tragic accident. The three of us were fishing together off the north coast of Cornwall, and they were both drowned, and I was the survivor. And
you saw this?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So of course, all of my life has been marked by that, has been built, has grown around that. This is part of who I am. It never leaves you. It never goes away. But
you had that dream.
And I did. That's right. I found dreams and strong experiences visiting me, about my dad and my brother along the walk.
Along the walk?
Yes.
Had you had a dream about your father before?
Yes, sometimes. Yeah,
but that was very interesting. It was, I think, if my memory serves me right, it was the first night of your walk you had that dream, or early on.
It was early on in the walk, and it was in Arras.
Yes.
And I had this dream. It was very peculiar, of my father. And I was cradling my father in my lap, so it was a sort of Pietà kind of image, of the son. I was kind of cradling the father. And that it was as if this kind of whole century, like this whole 100 years of grief, was kind of flowing out of him. My father was a very strong, robust man, a sort of outdoors man, a farmer and a gardener, but also a man of letters, and warm, and, a really wonderful father, wonderful man. And it was as if he'd sort of surrendered finally to sorrow, sadness and grief, and allowed himself to become the one who was weak. And I was cradling him in my lap. And all of the griefs of my family's history, his uncle's death in World War I, age 17, and the death of a younger brother in infancy, the murder of my father's niece, his own death and the death of my brother, and there's so many tragedies in our family. It's all in the book.
Yes.
And I woke up, and I suddenly thought, Arras, was that where my great uncle Claire or Clarence was killed in World War I? And I got in touch with my cousin, who's sort of the fount of all family, folklore, cousin David, and I said, I'm in Arras. Is that where Uncle Claire was killed? And he said, yes. He said, it's almost exactly 100 years ago. He was killed at the Battle of Arras in May 1917, and there you are, you're there.
You're there.
And And I was absolutely certain that he died at the Somme in 1916, but it wasn't. It was there. And it was as if, I don't know, that the 100 years of my own family's kind of struggles and suffering and tragedies and so on, through many wars and somehow came in parallel with the 100 years of the Palestinian story.
It all collided.
Yes. All came together.
It all came together.
You know, and Uncle Claire's body was never found. And so his name is on the memorial wall of the Arras Memorial, which is quite overwhelming. It's one of these very, very beautiful British Empire memorials by Edwin Lutyens, you know, and in sort of red, brown, and blonde stone, and you know, with the great field of white gravestones and the memorial wall. And my grandfather, I remember him saying how angry he was that the recruiting office had accepted Claire when he lied about his age. There's so many of them did. The official records say Second Lieutenant Clarence Edward Butcher died, you know, May so-and-so 1917, aged 19. And my grandfather was adamant that he wasn't, he was 17.
Yes. On your journey on this walk, were there some scary moments?
Yeah, there were wild dogs in Greece.
Oh,
there's an awful lot of wild dogs in Greece. We got quite kind of
so many.
Really. So
did they run after you?
Yeah. So the villagers would greet us with smiles and bring fruit out for us, and you know, even coffee or whatever. The dogs would greet us snarling, you know, and come running at our ankles. And, you know, so we used to fill our pockets with pebbles.
Yeah, you had to.
Absolutely, and just a lob of pebble in that. And if, I mean, in all seriousness,
no, it was like a plague. The dogs.
There was, and there was actually. You might remember the story on the news. There was a British woman actually killed by wild dogs a week or so before in that part of Greece that we were walking through. She was very, very unfortunate. We were in reasonable-sized groups, you know, and we were able to stick together when that happened. Even worse in Turkey. And the dogs are absolutely kind of fearless. Even you know, if you were driving, they launch themselves at the vehicle, you know. So wild dogs in Greece. Tear gas in Bethlehem. What else? Settler violence in Hebron. You know, walking slap bang into a confrontation with very, very angry and aggressive settlers in Hebron. There were some hairy moments. Yes.
But each day you had this little liturgy that you all said. Would that be right at the beginning of the day?
The beginning of the day. That's right.
And if, do you want to tell us what that liturgy is? Yes, that'll be great.
I mean, many of you are very, very biblically literate, so you will recognise, you know, the sort of biblical antecedents of the liturgy, and so we begin each day gathered in a little circle outside the ibis budget, or the convent, or the campsite, or wherever we were. And often someone would come up with a little reflection. It might be a poem or a thought or something, you know, and we would invite different people to, you know, make that contribution. And then we'd say this liturgy, another world is not only possible, she is on her way. Words of Arundhati Roy. Another world is not only possible, she's on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. You have been shown what is good, to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly. We walk this day with those whose freedom is denied. We walk with those who have fled war, torture, and despair. We walk in penance for broken promises and political fixes. We walk the long road with all those who strive for peace, justice, and reconciliation. We walk with those who long to return to home. We walk in hope that one day all people in the Holy Land will live in peace as neighbours with full equal rights. Walk softly upon the earth, may its beauty surround you. May its wisdom delight you, its music invite you. May you love and be loved. May you know peace and practice compassion. Rejoice in the earth and in all of creation. Rejoice in life. Ambulando solvitur. It will be solved by walking.
And at the beginning of that, you quote a verse from Micah,
Yeah.
chapter 6, verse 8, where the question is put, what does God want us to do? And the answer is, he wants us to...
to love mercy.
Love mercy.
To walk humbly and act justly.
Act justly, yeah. And
does
that
God
kind of
require of you?
inspired you,
Yes.
on your journey.
Absolutely. And the prophet Micah comes into the end of the story as well.
Yeah.
Because we're perhaps jumping around in the timeline here, but when we did arrive at last in Jerusalem, the final event on the day of the Balfour Centenary was a wonderful celebratory service in St. George's Cathedral in Jerusalem.
Yes.
And the preacher was the great Canon Naim Atik, the father of Palestinian liberation theology and the founder of the Sabeel Ecumenical Liberation Center in Jerusalem. And he spoke wonderfully, movingly, of his vision of a shared Holy Land, of a shared Jerusalem, and of the words of the prophet Micah. You know, in the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and peoples will stream to it. Many nations will come and say, "Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge between many peoples and will settle disputes for strong nations far and wide. They will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation will not take up sword against nation, nor will they train for war anymore. Everyone will sit under their own vine and under their own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid, for the Lord Almighty has spoken." And it took me back to that moment where Ali Salim and his family were pulling chairs
to give you
out of the
hospitality.
rubble to seat us in the shade of their fig tree. And that was in the village of Al-Khada, St. George in Arabic. And this was in St. George's Cathedral in Jerusalem at the end of the journey. And there was the prophet Micah again. And we were supposed to have this wonderful Palestinian choir, the Choir of Bethlehem, singing to us at the service. And they were late because they were held at a checkpoint and they couldn't get through from Bethlehem to Jerusalem. And then at the very last minute of this service, they rushed in, absolutely breathless, having made it through the checkpoint and made it to the event, and pelted their way to the front to sing these fabulous Arabic melodies to us. And this, in a sense, spoke eloquently about the whole venture that we had walked unimpeded for 3,400 kilometers over 147 days from London to Jerusalem to be there. And they, coming from Bethlehem, which is a 5-minute drive away, were held and weren't able to get through.
So just tell us about that last day.
It was mad. It was absolutely crazy. The final day, the Balfour Centenary. The day began with our visit to the British Consul General in East Jerusalem. So this is the diplomatic mission, Her Majesty's representative in the Palestinian territories. Our ambassador to Israel has an embassy in Tel Aviv. The Consul General is in East Jerusalem, in Nashashibi Street, and we were his guests very early in the morning for coffee and pastries in this beautifully civilized sort of colonial enclave, you know, of the British consulate, where we sort of delivered our representation to him of the new Balfour Declaration, which our trustee Robert Cohen had rewritten, taking the same 67 words of Arthur James Balfour 100 years before and rewriting them to speak about equal rights in the land, and that the nations of the world should use their best endeavours to essentially support the project of a safe and secure home for all who live in the Holy Land. We delivered this and an open letter to the Prime Minister, to Philip Hall, the British Consul General. Now, Theresa May had decided to announce in Parliament the week before that she would be celebrating the centenary of the Balfour Declaration at a festive dinner with Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, in London with the current Lord Balfour and Lord Rothschild. And she said, Britain, we will be celebrating this centenary with pride. Britain is proud of our role in creating the State of Israel. The impact of her words up and down the West Bank was felt in every single school, refugee camp, village, Bedouin tent, city hall. Everywhere we went, Palestinians were asking us with bewilderment and dismay, why is your Prime Minister celebrating? Why is she proud? Why is she celebrating 100 years of our suffering? The mayor of the village of Sa'ir near Hebron made a beautiful speech where he said Britain is a country we look to as a great country, a country that can teach history, teach civilization, teach poetry. She is a great nation. To hear from the Prime Minister of Britain such a thing is very shameful. And so, by contrast, our mission, our pilgrimage to visit so many Palestinian communities up and down the West Bank with this message of solidarity to say we've walked over all this time and so many miles to say sorry for the actions of our government 100 years ago, for the century of suffering, injustice and dispossession which the British government visited on the Palestinian people, to stand with you in solidarity and to express our hope. We were treated like superstars.
Yes.
I mean, that wasn't the idea of going there,
Sure.
but that was what happened. It's impossible to overstate the extraordinary overflow of generosity and warmth and love which our mission brought.
Yes.
And President Mahmoud Abbas saw me on a television interview in Ramallah and phoned our friends from Holy Land Trust immediately and said, I want to meet Justin and all the walkers and bring them to lunch in Ramallah. Please give our greetings to them. We're so, so pleased with what they're doing. And the Palestinian media and all the Arabic media from across the Middle East followed our every step. And we became this kind of superstar mission. And so on the centenary from Jerusalem, we went to Ramallah to a vast demonstration in the streets of Ramallah with Palestinian marching bands, Boy Scouts and Girl Guides, every flag under the sun, and a vast demonstration in the city centre and the world's media there. Then we went to this banquet in the presidential compound, and then finally in the afternoon back to the Mount of Olives to complete the walk into Jerusalem. We said our liturgy for the last time on the Mount of Olives, overlooking from the place where, according to legend, or according to tradition, I should say, Jesus is meant to have looked down on the city and wept. And then we walked down the Mount of Olives and entered the old city through the Lion's Gate, which is also believed to be the site of the martyrdom of St. Stephen, where Israelis 50 years ago and the Ottomans 500 years ago conquered the old city, and Palestinian drivers tooted their horns and clapped and cheered us, and all of our companions lined the streets and cheered us in through the Lion's Gate, and this great tide of joy and hope surged, and we sort of whooped our way scandalously down the Via Dolorosa to St. George's Cathedral, absolutely sort of overflowing with euphoria, with hope, having completed the journey, and had such an incredible welcome And that what we'd hoped for, which was to offer some love and some empathy and something healing to a forgotten people,
yes,
that had been received as something meaningful and of value,
sure,
was beyond what we could hope for.
Imagine. But you didn't walk back.
No.
No, no. So got back and had a nice bath and your cup of tea in your own cup. That's what I love. When I go away, I come back, my teacup, my cup of tea. Yeah.
All those things.
All those things. So the story, Justin, is in detail in this book with lots of stories within stories. And, you know, what is it that you're hoping as, you know, people of faith, people of no faith might read this book? What are you hoping the reader would respond to?
I suppose the best thing I can hope for is that I can, through this book, I can help to communicate a sense of the extraordinary courage and beauty of the humanity of the Palestinian people. That after 50 years of occupation, 70 years of dispossession, and a century of the denial of their rights, the Palestinian people maintain an astonishing dignity, an astonishing warmth and vitality and hope that the tiny, tiny Palestinian Christian population, now dwindled to just 1% of the West Bank, have not given up on being the living stones of the Holy Land, the indigenous church of the Holy Land. Relations between Christians and Muslims are very good in the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza. And so the Palestinian community is in one sense a model or a beacon for coexistence in the Middle East, where so many places in Iraq and Syria, ancient, age-old Christian communities have been destroyed or driven into exile. There's still, for the most part, very, very peaceful coexistence there between Christians and Muslims. And of course, for centuries, Jews have lived alongside Christians and Muslims in the Holy Land. Sephardic Jews, known at one time as Arab Jews, who spoke Arabic, who dressed like Arab people and practiced their Jewish faith, who were exiles from the Spanish kingdom, you know, in the 15th century, when the Catholic rulers of Spain kicked out all the Jews and kicked out all the Moorish Muslims. Where did they find sanctuary? In the Ottoman Empire in the East, where Jews, Christians and Muslims have always lived together. So there is hope. I hope that I can communicate some of the dignity and beauty of spirit, the vitality, the love of life of people in the Holy Land, and of some of my Israeli friends as well, who are working for peace and justice there. I was asked earlier today in an interview, I think it was with the Church Times, about solutions, and I do think that British people have been offering solutions for a long time, and you know, it's actually for Palestinians and Israelis to work out what they want the future to look like. Their friends, people who want to support them around the world, can keep calling for equal rights. What that will look like in the end, whether it's one state or 2 states or 15 states, whether it's some kind of binational state, is up for the people who live there to decide. But it's not that there aren't a number of solutions available. There are any number of solutions available. It's about the political will. And maybe some moving and touching and evocative and possibly funny stories from that part of the world can help to contribute a little droplet to the groundswell of zeitgeist that will contribute to that will.
Walking to Jerusalem, published by
Hodder and Stoughton.
And available where?
Available where? Did you say?
How can we get this?
Well, in Waterstones.
Yes.
And through the Hodder's website, and through the Amazon, of course, and through Amos Trust as well, my partner in this whole venture, and other bookshops as well from today.
Justin, you're a very fascinating person, actually. You know, it's someone who's an actor, a playwright, a director, a producer, who has compassion and passion for a particular cause, that you've actually made time in the midst of your primary vocation to respond to this particular need. And I think that's very challenging for all of us who've listened into your conversation, that in the midst of our own vocations and our own commitments and, you know, primary focus, it doesn't mean that we can't ignore people and needs that are around us. You know, we can't help everyone, but we can help someone. And that's very admirable. And I think it's admirable that, you know, you as a Christian care both for the Jews and the Palestinians, and that you're working towards the peace of Israel.
Inshallah, inshallah.
Amen. Well, Justin Butcher, thank you very much.